they rode like a thunderstorm across the endless steppes of Asia, not as scattered raiders but as a tide of destruction that surged with frightening precision, leaving only ashes in their path, and in just a single generation, the Mongol Empire would become the greatest killer in recorded history, erasing millions of lives with a terrifying mixture of mobility, strategy, and psychological dominance that turned thriving cities into graveyards and bustling marketplaces into silent ruins. And to those who heard the sound of their horses' hooves, it was as though nature itself had turned against them, because these warriors did not come only to conquer, but to annihilate, to demonstrate a scale of violence that was both physical and symbolic, crafted to terrify entire civilizations into submission before the first arrow was even released. And what makes their story uniquely chilling is not merely the staggering number of deaths, but the speed with which this devastation unfolded. For within less than a century, this empire grew from scattered nomadic clans to the largest continuous land empire in history, stretching from the Pacific shores of China to the fertile plains of Hungary, yet leaving in its wake a trail of blood that would forever alter the world's demographics, politics, and even its climate. And when we look back across time at their campaigns, we see not just soldiers, but a storm system of human will that obliterated populations, erased cultures, and even changed the trajectory of rivers and forests as abandoned farmland reclaimed by nature pulled carbon from the air, a legacy so vast that modern science can still measure the impact of their violence on the very earth itself. And yet behind the terrifying statistics lies a human story, one born from the harsh struggles of a boy named Temujin, who would rise from obscurity to unite rival tribes and forge an army more disciplined and efficient than any the world had yet seen, and his personal tragedies, betrayals, and survival in an unforgiving land created a leader who saw mercy as weakness and fear as a weapon, a man who wielded terror not simply for slaughter, but as a deliberate tool of conquest, shaping one of history's most unstoppable forces. And so this tale begins not with numbers alone, but with a human heartbeat of ambition, vengeance, and survival that turned the Mongol Empire into the deadliest storm the world has ever known, a storm that reshaped civilizations, silenced millions, and carved into the collective memory of humanity a lesson in how power wielded without restraint can transform history itself. And as we begin this journey through the 20 parts of this story, we will trace not only how they conquered, but why their conquests left scars so deep they remain visible centuries later, reminding us that the legacy of fear is one of the most enduring monuments any empire can leave behind. The rise of Genghis Khan, born as Temujin, begins not with glory but with hardship, for his early life was marked by betrayal, abandonment, and a relentless fight for survival in the harsh landscapes of the Mongolian steppes. And it was these struggles that forged the steel of his character, shaping him into the leader who would one day command the largest empire the world had ever seen. And as a child he knew hunger as an intimate companion. For after his father was poisoned by rivals, his family was cast aside by their tribe, left to fend for themselves in a wilderness where every meal had to be clawed from the earth or hunted with desperate resolve. And in this crucible of scarcity, Temujin learned two truths that would define his empire. Loyalty must be earned, and fear must be wielded. And from the beginning he carried the scars of betrayal, for even his own kin would sometimes turn against him in the fight for scraps. Yet he endured, guided by a fierce determination that would one day elevate him above every rival. And as he grew older, he gathered around him not only warriors but companions who recognized his strength of will. And unlike many leaders of his age, he did not bind men through noble bloodlines or mere tradition, but by merit, rewarding skill and loyalty above birthright, which inspired fierce devotion among those who followed him. Because in a world fractured by clan rivalries, he promised unity through strength, and his personal charisma and unshakable resolve drew to him men who were tired of endless infighting, who craved a leader capable of transforming scattered tribes into a single unstoppable force. and in battles against rival clans, Temujin revealed a ruthless cunning, never hesitating to punish betrayal with merciless retribution, yet also showing an ability to forgive when forgiveness could strengthen his base of power, and his combination of brutal discipline and pragmatic flexibility allowed him to gradually bring together the warring tribes of the steppe under his leadership, binding them with laws known as the yasa, rules that enforced order across a society accustomed to chaos. And as his vision expanded beyond tribal unity toward empire building, Temujin began to see himself not merely as a chieftain, but as a destined ruler whose authority was sanctioned by the eternal blue sky, a divine mandate that gave his cause a spiritual resonance, and in this belief he inspired his people to see their struggle not simply as conquest but as destiny itself. And with every victory his legend grew until he became Genghis Khan, the universal ruler, a title earned not through inheritance but through sheer force of will. And what makes his rise so compelling is not just the empire he built, but the way his personal suffering and resilience created a leader who understood both the fragility of human life and the power of fear to control it. A leader whose vision would transform scattered horsemen into an army feared from China to Europe. And as the boy who once scavenged for survival became the man who commanded nations, the stage was set for the Mongol storm that would soon engulf the known world. When Genghis Khan began to shape his vision of conquest, he understood that uniting the tribes was only the beginning, for without a disciplined force capable of defeating not just rival clans but mighty kingdoms, his dream would collapse into dust. And so he began the deliberate and revolutionary process of forging the Mongol army, transforming scattered horsemen into the most efficient war machine the world had yet seen. And unlike other leaders who relied on nobility and tradition, he broke the old systems of privilege and replaced them with an unshakable loyalty to him and the cause of empire, assigning positions based on merit and achievement rather than birthright, which meant that a poor herdsman could rise to become a commander if he proved his courage and skill, and this created a force bound by shared ambition rather than fractured loyalties, while at the same time Genghis introduced a strict chain of command organized into groups of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000, a structure that ensured every soldier knew his place and every commander could be trusted to follow orders with precision. And the genius of this system lay not just in its clarity, but in its flexibility. For the Mongol army could split into smaller units to strike swiftly, or combine into massive forces capable of overwhelming entire cities, and at the heart of their strength were their horses, tough steppe ponies that carried riders across vast distances, enabling them to travel farther and faster than any enemy could imagine, giving the Mongols a mobility that made them seem less like men and more like a force of nature. And every soldier carried multiple mounts, allowing them to ride tirelessly while their enemies exhausted themselves, and this endurance became their deadliest weapon, for they could appear where no army should be, striking from impossible distances and vanishing before resistance could form. And Genghis ensured that discipline was absolute, punishing deserters with death but rewarding loyalty with plunder and honour, creating an incentive system that bound his men tightly to him. And he also demanded innovation, adopting technologies and tactics from conquered peoples, particularly siege engines from China, which would soon allow them to break the walls of fortified cities that once believed themselves untouchable. And perhaps most terrifying was their mastery of psychological warfare. For Genghis drilled his army not only in battle formations but in the art of terror, orchestrating massacres or spreading rumours to break enemy morale before a single arrow flew, and through this relentless training and unyielding discipline, the Mongol army ceased to be a loose collection of tribes and became instead a storm of organised violence, a mobile, adaptive, and utterly loyal machine that could bend nations to its will. And as Genghis stood at the head of this newly forged force, he held in his hands not only the power to unite the steppes, but the means to devastate the world beyond them, setting into motion a campaign that would drench continents in fear and blood. and the stage was now set for his warriors to ride out and announce their arrival, not as raiders but as the heralds of a new world order. If there was one weapon sharper than the Mongol sword and faster than the Mongol horse, it was fear itself, for Genghis Khan understood that terror could conquer cities more efficiently than endless battles, and so he wielded it with ruthless precision, crafting a reputation that raced ahead of his armies like a dark wind, breaking the spirit of his enemies before the first clash of steel, and stories spread of entire populations slaughtered, of rivers running dark after sieges, and of cities so terrified of Mongol retribution that they opened their gates without resistance, surrendering in exchange for survival. And while many rulers believed themselves safe behind stone walls, the Mongols knew how to turn those very walls into prisons of panic, sometimes sparing a few survivors deliberately so they could flee to the next city and recount the horrors they had seen, ensuring that terror multiplied across the land like a disease. And when his armies approached, villagers often abandoned their homes, scattering into forests and deserts rather than face certain destruction, leaving ghost towns behind that spoke louder than any battle cry. And Genghis himself cultivated this aura, by ensuring that disobedience was punished with merciless finality, for when a city resisted, its population was exterminated with systematic brutality, while those who submitted were often spared, though never allowed to forget who held power over their lives, and thus fear became a weapon of choice, as deliberate and strategic as the bow and arrow, because it allowed the Mongols to win wars without exhausting their resources, and beyond physical violence, psychological tactics were woven into every campaign, such as the use of false retreats to lure enemies into ambushes, or the lighting of countless campfires to give the illusion of an army far larger than reality, amplifying dread to unmanageable levels, and even their appearance added to the terror, for mounted archers covered in armour and moving as one seemed less like men and more like an unstoppable tide, and the drum beats of their advance were said to echo across the earth like thunder, striking fear in the hearts of those who listened. And what made this method devastating was its efficiency, because fear demanded no rations, no horses, no arrows, and yet it could bring down the mightiest cities, creating a ripple effect where kingdoms would fall not simply from defeat, but from despair. And so the Mongol storm was carried on whispers as much as on hoofbeats, with chronicles describing them as a scourge sent by heaven, a punishment upon nations, and whether one believed in divine wrath or human cruelty, the outcome was the same, an empire expanding not only through blood but through the silent submission of those too afraid to resist, and thus fear became the invisible ally of Genghis Khan, a weapon more enduring than steel, one that carved the path for conquest stretching from the Great Wall of China to the gates of Europe, proving that the most powerful empire in history was built not only by strength of arms, but by mastery of the human mind. When the Mongol army first rode out from the steppes to test its strength beyond the familiar world of rival clans, the earth trembled under the hooves of tens of thousands of horsemen, and these early campaigns became the proving ground for Genghis Khan's vision of empire, setting the tone for the destruction and transformation that would follow. For the Mongols moved first against northern China and Central Asia, where wealthy cities, ancient fortresses and powerful rulers believed themselves unassailable behind stone walls and large armies. Yet what they did not realize was that the storm now advancing toward them was unlike anything they had faced before, and when the Mongols struck, they struck with speed and coordination that defied expectation, sweeping through vast distances in days rather than months, surrounding enemy forces with deadly precision and overwhelming armies that had relied on slow-moving infantry and rigid formations, and the chronicles tell of entire towns collapsing into chaos at the mere sight of the Mongol banners, because their reputation, already fed by calculated terror, arrived before their arrows did, and in the campaigns against the Xia dynasty of northern China, Genghis Khan proved that the Mongols were not merely raiders, but conquerors, capturing cities that had stood for centuries and forcing sophisticated kingdoms to realize that their walls were no longer guarantees of safety, and these victories were not just about land, but about resources. For by raiding and absorbing wealth, the Mongols gained access to advanced siege technologies, new tactics, and artisans who were often spared specifically for their skills. And as the campaign spread westward into Central Asia, the destruction grew even more infamous, as cities like Bukhara and Samarkand, once jewels of culture and trade, were shattered in days, their populations decimated and survivors enslaved, yet their skilled workers relocated to enrich the Mongol war machine. And through these early campaigns, Genghis demonstrated the dual edge of his strategy: annihilation for resistance and survival for those who submitted, ensuring that news of his wrath travelled faster than his armies, softening targets long before the first confrontation, and beyond military might. These campaigns gave the Mongols a taste of the immense wealth that lay beyond the steppe: silks, spices, precious metals, and fertile lands that promised more than survival. They promised dominance over civilizations that had once dismissed nomads as barbarians, and with every victory the Mongol army grew bolder, more disciplined, and more inventive, learning to adapt quickly to new environments and foes, and what had begun as the unification of tribes now transformed into a continental mission of conquest, with Genghis at its heart, driven by personal ambition, vengeance for past betrayals, and a belief that his destiny was sanctioned by the eternal blue sky. And as his banners rose over ruined walls and smouldering marketplaces, the first campaigns of the Mongol Empire revealed a chilling truth. This was not the climax, but only the beginning of a storm that would soon reach across the breadth of the known world. The fall of Khwarezm stands as one of the darkest chapters in the story of the Mongol Empire, a campaign that revealed not only Genghis Khan's military genius, but also the terrifying scale of his vengeance. For it began not with conquest, but with commerce, when the great Khan sent a caravan of merchants westward to the Khwarezmian Empire, hoping to establish trade relations with a wealthy state that stretched across Persia and Central Asia. Yet what should have been the start of peaceful exchange ended in betrayal, when the governor of Otrar, suspecting the merchants of espionage, seized them, executed some, and confiscated their goods. And when Genghis Khan sent envoys demanding justice, the Sultan of Khwarezm, Ala ad-Din Muhammad, compounded the insult by killing one of the ambassadors and mutilating the others, an act of defiance that lit the fuse of Mongol wrath. For in the eyes of Genghis Khan, this was not merely an attack on his men, but a personal affront to his honour, and in Mongol culture such an insult could only be answered with total destruction. And so the Khan unleashed his army, riding westward in a storm of retribution that would erase Khwarezm from the map, and what followed was a campaign of calculated annihilation, as the Mongols crossed deserts thought impassable, outmaneuvered larger armies, and struck at cities with a fury so overwhelming that entire populations were slaughtered, with Bukhara falling first, its mosques desecrated and its people massacred, followed by Samarkand, which was overwhelmed despite its proud defences, and as each city collapsed, survivors were executed or enslaved, while artisans were spared to serve the Mongol war machine, and everywhere else, corpses piled high as a warning to those who might resist, and the Sultan, who had once mocked the idea of Mongol power, fled westward in panic, abandoning his people to their fate until he died in exile, a broken man chased by the memory of his lost empire. And perhaps the most chilling episode came at the city of Urgench, where the Mongols faced fierce resistance but responded with such ferocity that chronicles describe the streets filled with bodies and rivers clogged with the dead, an image of devastation so complete that Khwarezm as a political entity ceased to exist, its wealth plundered, its cities burned, its people erased. And this campaign demonstrated a new level of Mongol warfare, where revenge and strategy combined into an unstoppable force, proving that defying Genghis Khan meant not just defeat, but extermination, and the destruction of Khwarezm sent shockwaves across the known world, for news of its fall spread terror from the Middle East to Europe, warning kings and sultans alike that the Mongol storm was not a distant rumour but an unstoppable reality. And by the end of this campaign, the Mongol Empire had expanded dramatically, gaining not only land but also control over trade routes that connected east and west, laying the foundation for further expansion, and above all the fall of Khwarezm etched into history a brutal lesson: insult the Khan and your civilization would vanish. The Mongol Empire, often remembered for its lightning-fast cavalry and relentless pursuit across open steppes, also transformed the art of siege warfare in ways that shocked the medieval world. For while their horsemen could sweep across vast landscapes and crush armies in the field, conquering fortified cities required a different kind of brilliance, and Genghis Khan understood that to truly dominate the known world, he needed more than speed and terror. He needed the ability to break walls, shatter defences, and reduce cities that had stood for centuries. And so the Mongols became masters of adopting and perfecting foreign technologies, drawing from the knowledge of Chinese, Persian, and Arab engineers to build a siege arsenal unrivaled in its time, employing towering catapults capable of hurling massive stones that splintered gates and walls, constructing siege towers that allowed archers to rain arrows upon defenders from above, and even using early forms of gunpowder-based weaponry like fire lances and explosive bombs that created chaos behind enemy walls, innovations that struck terror into populations that had never before seen such destructive force. And beyond machines, the Mongols perfected psychological warfare, surrounding cities with prisoners forced to dig trenches or carry supplies, demoralizing defenders by parading captured civilians before the walls, and spreading fear with false rumours of invincibility, tactics that often convinced towns to surrender before a single stone was launched. And when surrender did not come, the Mongols displayed patience rare for nomadic warriors, encircling strongholds, cutting off food and water, and waiting until desperation forced capitulation, proving that they could outlast as well as outfight, and perhaps their greatest innovation lay in mobility. For unlike most medieval armies that moved slowly with heavy equipment, the Mongols developed ingenious methods to transport siege engines across deserts and mountains, disassembling machines into parts carried on pack animals and reassembling them at the battlefield, allowing them to bring the full weight of destruction to places thought unreachable. And in the capture of Zhongdu, the great city of the Jin dynasty, the Mongols employed siege engines brought from conquered Chinese engineers, raining destruction on its walls until the city fell, while at Samarkand and Nishapur, their ingenuity in tunnelling and using incendiary devices overwhelmed defenders who had believed their walls impenetrable. And the combination of mobility, adaptability, and merciless determination made the Mongols not just raiders, but conquerors of civilizations, reshaping the balance of power across Asia and Europe. For no fortress was safe, no wall high enough, and no gate strong enough to withstand them. And this mastery of siegecraft ensured that their empire could not only dominate open plains, but also reduce empires built upon stone and mortar, reinforcing the legend that resistance was futile. For if the horsemen did not ride you down in the fields, their engines of war would crush you in your citadel. And this evolution in warfare, blending steppe traditions with imported technologies, marked a turning point that allowed the Mongol Empire to continue its unstoppable expansion, breaking through defences that once seemed eternal. The conquest of Persia stands as one of the bloodiest and most decisive chapters in the rise of the Mongol Empire, for after Genghis Khan had secured the steppes and crushed the Khwarezmian Empire, he turned his attention to the Persian heartlands, determined to exact vengeance and assert dominance over one of the most culturally rich regions of the medieval world, a campaign sparked not only by political ambition, but also by betrayal. For when the Shah of Khwarezm seized a Mongol trade caravan and executed the ambassadors sent by Genghis Khan, it was seen as an unforgivable insult, one that could only be repaid in devastation, and so the Mongol army swept into Persia with a fury that stunned its cities, combining the mobility of their horse archers with the siege innovations they had perfected, ensuring that no city, no matter how fortified, could withstand their relentless onslaught, and towns that resisted were levelled, their populations massacred or enslaved, while those that surrendered were often spared but left in fear, creating a reputation that spread faster than the horsemen themselves. And among the most infamous moments was the destruction of Nishapur, where Mongol wrath left the city in ruins and its people annihilated, a grim warning to others, while the great city of Herat, after fierce resistance, eventually fell to Mongol engines and fire, leaving behind smouldering ruins. Yet beyond violence, the Mongols also absorbed Persian administrators, artisans and scholars into their growing empire, recognizing the value of Persian expertise in governance, astronomy and architecture, which later helped solidify Mongol control over vast territories. And Genghis Khan, ever pragmatic, saw Persia not only as a prize of conquest, but as a crossroads of trade and culture, vital for connecting the Silk Road routes between China, Central Asia and the Middle East, and his campaign ensured that this region would be forcibly integrated into the Mongol world order, though at the cost of immense suffering, for countless villages vanished, irrigation systems were destroyed, and famine stalked the land, changing the demographic and agricultural landscape of Persia for generations. And yet, in their brutality, the Mongols also brought about a new order, enforcing their laws with ruthless consistency, reducing tribal rivalries, and ensuring the flow of trade and tribute, transforming Persia into both a victim of conquest and a foundation for empire, for from its ruins rose a new Mongol-controlled domain that linked east to west in ways previously unimagined, and the conquest of Persia revealed the dual nature of Mongol power, the hand that destroyed and the hand that rebuilt, a contradiction that both terrified and fascinated chroniclers of the time. And by the end of this campaign, the Shah of Khwarezm was dead, his dynasty shattered, and Persia bent beneath the weight of Mongol authority. A turning point that demonstrated to the world that no kingdom, no matter how ancient, could withstand the tide of Mongol expansion, a tide that now pressed toward new horizons, setting the stage for further conquest and the inexorable rise of an empire that would stretch farther than any before it. When the Mongols turned their gaze toward Eastern Europe, the continent trembled as if the earth itself knew that a storm was coming, for after subduing Persia and much of Central Asia, the armies of Batu Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, along with the brilliant General Subutai, surged westward with the same precision, speed, and terror that had broken so many empires before, and their arrival marked a clash between nomadic mastery and the rigid feudal systems of Europe, where kingdoms were fragmented, communication was slow, and rivalries left them unprepared for the tidal wave of Mongol warfare. And the first great test came at the Battle of the Khalkha River, where Mongol strategy demonstrated its genius, feigning retreat, luring Slavic princes into overconfidence, and then turning to annihilate them with encirclement and disciplined coordination, leaving Eastern Europe shaken by a defeat so crushing that whispers of Mongol invincibility spread like wildfire. And soon the raids extended deeper, striking into Poland and Hungary, where castles fell, villages burned, an entire population scattered, unable to comprehend the sheer swiftness of horse archers who seemed to appear and vanish with the wind. And at the Battle of Legnica in Poland, European knights, proud in their heavy armour, discovered their weakness against the hit-and-run tactics of Mongol cavalry, their charges broken, their formation shattered, and their lands left vulnerable, while Hungary faced the devastation of the Battle of Mohi, where Mongol engineers combined bridge destruction, river blockades, and coordinated assaults to obliterate the Hungarian army, leaving the kingdom scarred for generations. And though the Mongols did not permanently occupy much of Eastern Europe, their incursions demonstrated that even the mightiest Christian states were powerless before their adaptable strategies. For Europe had never faced an enemy so fluid, who carried no baggage trains, lived off the land, and could strike hundreds of miles apart only to converge with perfect timing, and fear spread so deep that towns surrendered at the mere rumour of their approach. Church bells rang in desperation, and rulers looked to the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor for salvation, yet none came, and only the death of Genghis Khan in Mongolia forced the Mongols to withdraw, sparing Europe from total conquest. Yet the shadow of their invasion lingered, for merchants, priests, and diplomats all told stories of fire raining from the east, of riders who seemed supernatural in endurance and cruelty, and this haunting memory reshaped European defences, trade, and diplomacy, even influencing the construction of fortifications and the urgency of uniting against outside threats, making the Mongol invasion of Eastern Europe not merely a military campaign, but a seismic event that altered the course of European history, proving once more that the empire forged by Genghis Khan and carried forth by his heirs was not just a power of the East, but a force that reached into the very heart of Christendom, reminding all that the steppe warriors could strike anywhere, anytime, with a ferocity that defied resistance. The Mongol invasions of China were not a single campaign, but a relentless series of wars that spanned decades, reshaping the very foundation of East Asia and forging one of the most dramatic chapters in the history of the Mongol Empire. For when Genghis Khan first turned his armies toward the lands of the Jin dynasty in northern China, he knew that conquering this ancient civilization would require not only courage, but also innovation, patience, and the ruthless resolve to grind down an enemy fortified by walls, wealth, and centuries of organized statecraft. And the Mongols, who thrived in the open steppe, quickly adapted to the complexities of Chinese warfare, employing Chinese defectors and engineers who introduced them to siege engines, catapults, and incendiary weapons that allowed them to reduce mighty fortresses once thought impregnable, and city after city fell as Genghis Khan's armies pressed deeper, leaving behind destruction, but also incorporating new technologies and administrative practices into their growing empire. And though initial victories were decisive, the conquest of northern China was far from simple, for the defenders, hardened by years of war, resisted fiercely, relying on fortified walls, dense urban centres, and vast manpower to stall the invaders. Yet the Mongols countered with mobility, surrounding cities, cutting off supplies and forcing surrenders through terror and attrition, and when the great city of Zhongdu, modern-day Beijing, resisted, the Mongols unleashed wave after wave of siege assaults until its defences crumbled, leaving the once glorious capital in ashes, a warning to all who dared oppose, and after securing the north, the Mongols set their sights on the southern Song dynasty, a wealthy and advanced kingdom that posed even greater challenges with its formidable river defences, naval fleets, and thriving urban economies. But here again the Mongols demonstrated unmatched adaptability, recruiting Chinese and Persian shipbuilders to create fleets of their own, learning to wage war on water as well as land, and after years of brutal campaigning marked by starvation, sieges, floods, and relentless assaults, the Mongols finally broke through, capturing Hangzhou, one of the richest cities in the world, and with its fall, China was brought under Mongol dominion, culminating in the establishment of the Yuan dynasty under Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, who had moved the empire from a nomadic tradition to a ruling dynasty rooted in Chinese civilization. Yet the road to this triumph was paved with suffering, for millions perished through starvation, massacres, and disease spread by protracted wars, leaving scars that echoed for centuries in Chinese memory. And the Mongol conquest of China did more than expand their empire. It created the foundation for a new synthesis of East and West, linking Chinese administration, Confucian ideals, and sophisticated urban economies with the raw power of steppe warfare, ensuring that the Mongol invasions of China were not only a military conquest, but also a cultural collision that reshaped Asia's destiny forever. While the Mongols are often remembered for their conquests and destruction, what truly cemented their dominance over such a vast empire stretching from the Pacific Ocean to the edges of Europe was not only the sword, but also their ability to govern with a surprisingly sophisticated and pragmatic administration system. For Genghis Khan and his successors recognized that sheer violence could subdue cities, but only efficient rule could hold them, and so they devised a model that blended steppe traditions with innovations borrowed from conquered peoples, creating one of the most remarkable governing structures of the medieval world, where loyalty was rewarded, merit often outweighed birth, and conquered populations were carefully categorized for maximum utility to the empire. And at the heart of this system lay the Yasa, the Mongol code of law, which set down principles of justice, loyalty, and order, ensuring that soldiers and civilians alike knew the rules that bound the empire together. And beneath the Khan, authority was distributed through a network of governors, tax officials, and military commanders who were often chosen based not on aristocratic lineage but on ability and proven service, allowing men of humble origins to rise through the ranks, which gave the empire both stability and loyalty. And the Mongols were shrewd in their use of local expertise, frequently employing Persian bureaucrats, Chinese administrators, and Central Asian scholars to manage finances, agriculture, and urban planning. For they knew that to maintain an empire of such scale, they had to embrace the knowledge of others, and taxation became a cornerstone of Mongol governance, with census-taking used to calculate revenue and ensure that every household contributed. Though the methods were harsh, the revenues funded not only military campaigns, but also infrastructure such as roads, way stations, and the famous yam system of mounted couriers, which allowed messages and orders to travel thousands of miles in mere days, binding the empire with a communication network unrivaled in its time. And commerce flourished under Mongol rule because they provided security to merchants across the Silk Road, guaranteeing safe passage under the Pax Mongolica, an era where goods, ideas, and technologies flowed more freely than ever before. And while the empire was not without cruelty, its administrative efficiency ensured that markets thrived, cities rebuilt, and diverse cultures interacted in ways that would have lasting global consequences, and religion too was treated with a remarkable degree of tolerance. For while the Khans themselves adhered to traditional Mongol beliefs, they allowed Buddhists, Muslims, Christians, and others to practice freely, provided they remained loyal and paid their dues, a policy that reduced resistance and encouraged cooperation. And so the Mongol administration system, though forged by conquerors, became a framework that sustained one of the largest land empires in history, demonstrating that beyond their fearsome reputation as warriors, they were also master organizers who understood that ruling an empire required more than terror. It required structure, vision, and the ability to weave together the talents of countless cultures into one functioning whole. Among the darkest legacies of the Mongol Empire was not just the bloodshed of war, but the silent killer that rode along their trade routes and armies, the Black Death, a plague that would devastate populations across Asia, the Middle East and Europe, and forever alter the course of history. For the Mongols, by establishing the Pax Mongolica and securing vast stretches of the Silk Road, unintentionally created the conditions for the rapid spread of disease, as caravans of merchants, envoys, soldiers, and migrants moved with unprecedented safety and speed, carrying not only silk, spices, and ideas, but also the unseen terror of infected fleas riding on rats that thrived in granaries, ships, and towns. And while outbreaks of plague had occurred in earlier centuries, it was under the shadow of Mongol expansion that the disease travelled farther and faster than ever before, with historians pointing to the siege of Kaffa on the Black Sea as one of the pivotal moments, where Mongol besiegers, weakened by the illness themselves, reportedly hurled infected corpses into the city as a form of biological warfare, driving panic and flight that spread the contagion into the Mediterranean world. And from there, Genoese ships carried the plague into European ports, unleashing a wave of death that would wipe out nearly half the population of the continent. But the Mongols themselves were not spared, for their interconnected empire meant that the plague cut down herders on the steppe, merchants on the Silk Road, and soldiers in their garrisons alike, weakening the bonds that held their dominion together, and the psychological toll was as severe as the physical devastation. For once, proud cities became silent. Families were torn apart and entire villages disappeared, leaving fields untended and trade routes deserted. And in Europe, the disease altered the very fabric of society, empowering labourers due to shortages, undermining feudal hierarchies, and sparking religious and social unrest, while in the Islamic world, it triggered both devastation and theological reflection, with scholars debating whether it was a punishment or a test. And through it all, the Mongol Empire's role was both indirect and undeniable, for their unification of Eurasia had created the highways along which the plague travelled, ensuring that what might have been a regional outbreak instead became one of the greatest pandemics in human history, and thus the Black Death, spread under the watch of Mongol rule, serves as a chilling reminder of how the very forces that fostered cultural exchange and economic growth could also unleash unimaginable tragedy, making the Mongol conquest not just an era of expansion, but also the backdrop for one of the most catastrophic biological events the world has ever seen. Subscribe now to uncover more untold stories of history's deadliest empires, shocking conquests, and forgotten battles that shaped our world. Though the Mongol Empire spread terror with its cavalry charges, siege engines, and reputation for annihilation, no empire could stretch across such vast lands without encountering resistance. And the story of the Mongols is not only one of conquest, but also one of rebellions and uprisings that tested their ability to maintain control. For from China to Persia, from Russia to the Middle East, subject peoples simmered with resentment at heavy taxation, forced conscription, and the crushing demands of occupation. And while many initially surrendered out of fear of destruction, once the immediate threat passed, courage often returned in the form of local revolts, such as in northern China, where Song loyalists continued to resist Mongol rule for decades, organising guerrilla bands that attacked supply lines and ambushed isolated garrisons, forcing the Mongols to commit constant resources to put down insurgents, or in Persia, where cities like Nishapur and Herat rose in bloody rebellion, only to face catastrophic reprisals that left their streets piled with bodies, a chilling reminder of the cost of defiance. And in Russia, the Mongol system of indirect rule through local princes fostered frequent tension, as Orthodox communities seethed under the burden of tribute demanded by the Golden Horde, sparking uprisings that erupted sporadically despite the severe consequences. And in the Islamic world, the memory of Baghdad's fall continued to inspire underground movements and scholars who framed Mongol dominance as a temporary scourge to be overcome, fueling spiritual as well as political opposition. Yet perhaps the most significant resistance came within China itself, where decades of Mongol rule under the Yuan dynasty left native Han populations bitter at foreign domination, high taxes, and social divisions that favoured Mongol and Central Asian elites, and this discontent simmered until it exploded in the Red Turban Rebellion of the 14th century, a mass uprising that blended millenarian religious beliefs with social grievances, eventually leading to the downfall of Mongol power in China and the rise of the Ming dynasty. And while some rebellions were crushed swiftly and brutally, others dragged on, wearing down Mongol resources, fracturing their unity, and eroding the aura of invincibility that had once caused cities to surrender at the mere sound of hooves. And these acts of resistance were not only political but cultural, for subjugated peoples found ways to preserve their traditions, faiths, and identities, despite the overwhelming force of their conquerors, creating quiet but powerful forms of rebellion that ensured Mongol rule would never be fully embraced. And so, the story of resistance and rebellions within the Mongol Empire reveals the limits of terror as a governing strategy. For while fear could win battles, it could not erase the human desire for autonomy, faith, and survival. And in the cracks of Mongol power, defiance endured, slowly but surely contributing to the unravelling of their dominion across continents. The death of a great conqueror is always a turning point in history, and for the Mongol Empire, The passing of Genghis Khan marked the beginning of a long struggle between unity and division. For although the empire had been built on discipline, loyalty, and the vision of a single leader, the moment that leader was gone, the vastness of the lands conquered, stretching from the coasts of China to the plains of Hungary, made it impossible for one person to govern without contention, and so the empire was divided among his descendants, a system meant to preserve both the family's power and the spirit of shared rule. But instead it planted the seeds of fragmentation, as each Khanate developed its own interests, ambitions, and cultural influences, creating rivalries that weakened the cohesion of what had once been an unstoppable force. And while the great Khan in Karakorum was still recognized as supreme, the reality was that the Golden Horde in Russia, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, and later the Yuan dynasty in China, each functioned almost as independent states, forging their own policies, alliances, and identities, with the Golden Horde adopting aspects of Russian governance and Orthodox traditions, the Ilkhanate blending Persian administration with Mongol martial strength, the Chagatai Khanate clinging to nomadic customs amidst growing Islamic influence, and the Yuan dynasty embracing the imperial trappings of Chinese civilization. And though this division initially allowed the empire to adapt to regional cultures, it also eroded the unity that had given the Mongols their greatest strength. For instead of riding as one people, they became competitors, sometimes even turning their weapons against one another, as seen in the bitter disputes over succession and the clashes between different branches of the family. And as the decades passed, these divisions deepened, leaving each Khanate vulnerable to rebellion from within and pressure from outside. Yet even as the empire fractured, its legacy endured, for the division of the empire created a network of interconnected states that still upheld trade along the Silk Roads, spread technologies, and fostered exchanges between East and West. And so, while the empire was no longer one united hammer, its broken pieces still shaped the destiny of nations, leaving behind a world forever changed by the Mongol conquest, but also forever shaped by the inevitability of division, which reminds us that even the mightiest empires cannot escape the pull of time, ambition, and human frailty. And in the story of the Mongols, the division of the empire is not simply a tale of decline, but of transformation, for out of one empire arose many states, each carrying a shard of Genghis Khan's legacy into the future. The rise of the Yuan dynasty in China under Kublai Khan marked one of the most extraordinary chapters in the saga of the Mongol Empire, for here was a nomadic conqueror who, unlike many of his predecessors, chose not to simply plunder and move on, but to establish a lasting rule over one of the most sophisticated civilizations of the medieval world. And in doing so, he transformed both the Mongols and China itself. For when Kublai declared himself Emperor of the Yuan in the late 13th century, he was not merely wearing the mantle of conquest, but embracing the traditions of the Middle Kingdom, moving his capital to Khanbalik, modern Beijing, and adopting the bureaucratic systems, Confucian ideals, and dynastic rituals that gave legitimacy to his rule in the eyes of the Chinese people. Yet his governance was never without tension, as the Mongols remained an elite warrior class, often distrusted by the native Han majority, leading to a social hierarchy where Mongols and Central Asians enjoyed privileges above the Chinese, creating resentment that simmered beneath the empire's glittering surface. But even with these divisions, the Yuan dynasty ushered in a period of remarkable cultural and economic exchange, for the Mongols secured and revitalized the Silk Roads, allowing merchants like Marco Polo to travel from distant Venice to the heart of China, spreading tales of wealth, innovation, and grandeur that captured the imagination of Europe. While within the Yuan realm, paper money became widespread. Cities flourished with diverse communities of Persians, Arabs, and Europeans, and great infrastructure projects such as the extension of the Grand Canal facilitated trade and agriculture, feeding the vast population under Mongol rule. And yet beneath the splendor of palaces and the hum of commerce, the Yuan dynasty also faced chronic struggles, for the heavy taxation demanded by endless military campaigns, floods along the Yellow River, and corruption within the bureaucracy strained the empire's foundations, while natural disasters were interpreted by many as signs that the Mongols lacked the mandate of heaven, the divine approval that had long legitimized Chinese dynasties, and so rebellions began to stir, with secret societies and peasant movements whispering of change. And though the Yuan dynasty represented the pinnacle of Mongol authority in East Asia, it also revealed the difficulty of ruling such a vast and culturally complex land. For in embracing the trappings of a settled empire, the Mongols lost some of the fierce unity that had once made them invincible, and while Kublai Khan's reign brought prestige and power, his successors would struggle to maintain the same control, leading to cracks in the foundation that would one day shatter into open revolt, proving that even the strongest dynasty born of conquest could not endure forever when burdened by division, corruption, and the weight of ruling a people who never truly accepted them as their own. The establishment of the Ilkhanate in Persia marked a turning point in the history of the Mongol Empire, for it demonstrated both the adaptability of Mongol rulers and the challenges of governing a region so deeply rooted in its own cultural and religious traditions, as Hulagu Khan, a grandson of Genghis, carved out his dominion in the mid-13th century after leading campaigns that crushed the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad and reduced powerful Persian cities into submission, an act that shocked the Islamic world and demonstrated the ruthless might of the Mongol armies. Yet once the dust of conquest settled, the Ilkhanid rulers faced the immense task of ruling over a land steeped in Islamic scholarship, Persian artistry, and centuries-old administrative systems, and though the Mongols initially ruled as outsiders, relying heavily on Central Asian advisors and Chinese administrators, over time they began to absorb the influences of Persian governance and culture, eventually blending nomadic traditions with the sophistication of Persian bureaucracy, and one of the most pivotal moments in this transformation was the conversion of Ghazan Khan to Islam at the close of the 13th century. For this act not only legitimized Mongol rule in the eyes of the majority Muslim population, but also initiated a wave of reforms aimed at stabilizing the economy, regulating taxes, and fostering a sense of continuity with Persia's rich dynastic past. And under Ghazan and his capable vizier, Rashid al-Din, the Ilkhanate became a centre of scholarship and historiography, producing the Jami al-Tawarikh, a monumental work of history that sought to weave together the stories of all peoples under heaven, reflecting the global vision of the Mongol world order. Yet despite these cultural achievements, the Ilkhanates struggled with chronic instability, for the vast trade routes that enriched Persia also made it vulnerable to conflicts with neighbouring powers such as the Mamluks of Egypt and the Golden Horde to the north, and internal rivalries among Mongol princes frequently weakened central authority, while recurring famines and plagues strained the population, reminding all that conquest and governance demanded more than military skill, and so the Ilkhanate stands as both a triumph and a tragedy in the Mongol story. A realm where Mongol rulers came closest to becoming Persian kings, yet could not entirely escape the fractures of empire, and when the line of Ilkhanid rulers faltered in the mid-14th century, Persia once again fragmented into smaller dynasties. Yet the legacy of Mongol influence endured in the administrative practices, the patronage of scholars, and the integration of Persia into the wider Eurasian networks of trade and culture that the Mongols had created, proving that even in decline the Ilkhanate left an indelible mark on the history of the Middle East and the trajectory of global exchange. The Golden Horde in Russia became one of the most enduring symbols of Mongol influence in Europe, a realm forged by Batu Khan, grandson of Genghis, after his armies swept through the steppes and forests of Eastern Europe in the 13th century, crushing principalities and establishing Mongol supremacy over the fragmented lands of the Rus. And though the Mongols did not settle these territories in great numbers, preferring to maintain their nomadic lifestyle on the open steppe, their rule was felt through the imposition of tribute, the installation of puppet princes, and the ever-present threat of Mongol retaliation should any ruler resist, and the system they created transformed Russia politically, economically, and culturally, for the princes of Moscow and other cities were forced to make long journeys to the horde's capital at Sarai to receive the yarlik, or patent of authority, an act that not only humbled them, but also made their power dependent on Mongol approval, yet, ironically, this system of subjugation laid the groundwork for the eventual rise of Moscow, as its princes became skillful tax collectors for the Khans, and gradually consolidated power under Mongol patronage, while the Russian Orthodox Church was granted protection and exemption from taxation, ensuring its survival and growth during a period when other institutions often faltered. And beyond politics, the Golden Horde opened Russia to the wider currents of Eurasian trade, linking its markets with those of China, Persia, and the Mediterranean, while also leaving lasting marks on language, military tactics, and governance, as Russian rulers learned the value of centralized authority and adapted Mongol administrative practices. Yet the relationship between overlords and subjects was never free of tension, for uprisings erupted from time to time, and rival powers such as the Grand Duchy of Lithuania and later the rising Kingdom of Poland exploited Mongol domination to expand their own influence over the borderlands, and over the centuries the Golden Horde itself began to fracture, weakened by internal strife, rival claimants to the throne, and the growing independence of its constituent khanates, such as those in Kazan and Crimea. And when the decisive Battle of Kulikovo took place in the late 14th century under the leadership of Dmitry Donskoy, it was celebrated as a sign that the Mongol grip on Russia was loosening, though in truth the Horde continued to exert control for another century, and only in the 15th century did the Principality of Moscow, under Ivan the Great, finally cast off Mongol suzerainty, marking the end of the so-called Tatar yoke. Yet even in their retreat the Golden Horde left behind a profound legacy, for they had reshaped the trajectory of Russian history, fostering both resilience and centralization, and embedding Russia permanently within the grand story of the Eurasian steppe empires. The Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia stood as one of the most intriguing branches of the Mongol Empire, born from the division of Genghis Khan's vast dominion among his sons, with Chagatai, the second son, inheriting the heartlands of the steppe stretching from the Altai Mountains to the borders of Persia, and this region, though strategically vital as the crossroads of the Silk Road, proved challenging to govern, for it was a land of diverse peoples, from settled oasis towns like Samarkand and Bukhara to fierce nomadic tribes who resisted central authority, and at first the Khanate attempted to uphold the Yasa, the legal code of Genghis Khan, preserving Mongol traditions of order, justice, and loyalty. Yet over time it became a state defined by contrasts and contradictions, for while its rulers claimed the legacy of their great forefather, many also fell into factionalism, rival clans, and religious disputes that gradually eroded their unity. And still, the Chagatai Khanate played a crucial role in shaping Central Asia, because it became the guardian of trade routes linking China with Persia and India, ensuring that merchants, scholars, and envoys could move across its vast landscapes, spreading ideas, technology, and cultures, and among its rulers, some such as Algu Khan and later Tamashirin attempted to stabilize the state, with Tamashirin even adopting Islam to appeal to the settled populations of Transoxiana. But his conversion angered the steppe elite who clung to old Mongol customs, sparking conflicts that further weakened cohesion. And these divisions mirrored the broader tension in Central Asia between nomadic tradition and sedentary civilization, a struggle that would echo for centuries, yet the Khanate's cultural impact cannot be understated, for under its protection, scholars preserved knowledge, artisans flourished, and caravanserais dotted the routes, turning the region into a living artery of the Silk Road. And even as political authority waned, the idea of Mongol supremacy remained embedded in the land, influencing future conquerors like Timur, who rose in the late 14th century by invoking the Mongol heritage while forging his own empire from the same soil. And so, the Chagatai Khanate, though often overshadowed by the Golden Horde or the Yuan dynasty, left behind a legacy of resilience and adaptation, symbolizing both the glory and fragility of Mongol power when transplanted into a region where cultures collided and identities merged. And in the grand story of the Mongol Empire, the Khanate served as both a bridge and a battleground, connecting the east and west, the nomad and the settler, the past and the future, proving that Central Asia was not just a stage upon which history was played, but a force that shaped the destiny of empires themselves. The decline of the Mongol Empire was not a sudden collapse, but rather a slow unravelling of the great web that Genghis Khan had so carefully woven. For what had once been a unified force stretching from the shores of the Pacific to the plains of Hungary began to crack under the weight of distance, rivalries, and cultural tensions. And as generations passed, the unity born of loyalty to Genghis Khan's vision faded, replaced by competing ambitions of his descendants, each eager to claim supremacy, and the divisions that began with the splitting of the empire into 4 great khanates: the Yuan dynasty in China, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Golden Horde in Russia, and the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, became fault lines that widened over time. For these states shared a common heritage yet pursued divergent paths, with rulers adopting local religions, customs and languages, diluting the once unifying force of Mongol identity. And while the empire's early strength had rested on unmatched military discipline, brilliant strategies, and fear that paralysed opponents, its later rulers grew complacent, some indulging in luxuries and court intrigues, rather than maintaining the ferocity and unity of the steppe, while others became entangled in endless wars against fellow Mongols, weakening their armies and draining their resources, and external enemies who had once cowered in terror learned to resist, building stronger fortifications, organising disciplined armies, and exploiting the disunity among Mongol rulers, and even the Silk Road, the empire's greatest artery of wealth, became harder to control as banditry increased and rival powers seized key routes, undermining the flow of goods, silver and ideas, while the devastation caused by the Mongols themselves left behind scars that hindered the recovery of many regions, reducing their capacity to sustain trade and prosperity, and the spread of the Black Death, which had been carried across Mongol trade networks, further devastated populations, crippling economies and fueling rebellion. While faith also played a role, for as different khanates adopted Islam, Buddhism or Christianity, they drifted further apart, each aligning more with local cultures than with their shared heritage, and the once feared thunder of Mongol horsemen was no longer a unifying roar, but fragmented echoes scattered across continents, and though the empire in fragments endured for centuries, its decline was inevitable, for no single leader after Genghis Khan and his immediate heirs could restore the unity of purpose that had built the greatest land empire in history, and so the Mongol Empire, once feared as unstoppable, slowly dissolved into the fabric of the very civilizations it had conquered, leaving behind not only ruins and stories of terror, but also a legacy of cultural exchange, trade, and political ideas that would shape the world long after the empire itself had vanished. The legacy of the Mongol conquests is a paradox of destruction and creation, for while their armies left behind shattered cities, empty fields, and countless lives lost, they also reshaped the world in ways that echoed across centuries. And at the heart of this paradox was Genghis Khan's vision of uniting disparate lands under a single rule, a feat no empire before had achieved on such a scale. For by linking China, Central Asia, Persia, and Europe through the Silk Road, the Mongols created an unprecedented network of cultural and economic exchange that allowed goods, knowledge, and even ideas to move freely across continents. And though many chroniclers of the time wrote only of their cruelty, modern historians recognize that without this forced integration, the world would have developed along very different lines. For technologies such as gunpowder, paper, and printing spread westward, while knowledge of astronomy, medicine, and mathematics flowed eastward, enriching civilizations on both sides, and even the Black Death, though catastrophic, reshaped societies in Europe by weakening feudal systems and opening space for social change, a consequence directly tied to Mongol trade routes, while in governance, the Mongols introduced administrative innovations such as merit-based promotions, religious tolerance, and codified laws through the yasa, principles that influenced states long after their empire dissolved, and their impact on warfare was equally transformative, for their mastery of mobility, intelligence gathering, and psychological tactics became templates studied by military leaders for centuries, and culturally the Mongol period was one of fusion, where Persian art influenced Chinese craftsmanship, where Turkish languages absorbed Mongol terms, and where even distant Europe gained new words and concepts from contact with the empire. And though the Mongols as a ruling dynasty disappeared in most regions, their bloodlines, customs, and legends persisted, shaping identities of peoples from the Kazakhs to the Uzbeks, from the Tatars to the Mughals in India, who claimed descent from Genghis Khan and built new empires on his foundation. And so when we speak of the Mongols, we are not merely recalling tales of destruction, but acknowledging a pivotal force in global history that both tore down and built up, leaving behind a legacy of connectivity, cultural fusion, and political ideas that remind us that even the most feared conquerors can also be architects of change. And in this balance of ruin and renewal, the Mongol Empire continues to stand as a reminder of how power, when wielded on such a colossal scale, reshapes the world in ways far beyond what its leaders might have ever imagined. The Mongol Empire did more than conquer. It erased, transformed, and redefined human history. From rivers of blood to the rebirth of trade, its story is one of terror, innovation, and survival. If the rise and fall of the Mongols teaches us anything, it's that empires built on fear may dominate for a generation, but their shadows linger for centuries. This was the storm that wiped out millions in a single generation, and changed the course of the world forever.